Hi everybody, I'm Adam Dawes. I'm a product manager at Google on the identity team.
Hey, and I'm Tim Bray. I'm a developer advocate on the identity team at Google, and we're in the business of trying to get people to
get out of the password business.
And so recently I wrote a blog piece about why I thought that was a good idea and people should get into federated login. And apparently I didn't quite convince 100% of the people who read it. Yeah, there were some comments which, well, let me try and represent the feeling I got from some of those comments. So I have my tinfoil hat here, and it was kind of like this. You want to capture all my information so you can give it to life insurance salesmen and credit check agencies, and then you're going to shovel all the data over the wall to the NSA so I can never buy a pressure cooker again in my life without having a full body cavity search every time I take a book out of the library. Are you crazy?
Tim, settle down. Settle down. Take the tinfoil hat off, please. We can talk about this rationally. Now, people do get a little bit exercised about a lot of these issues, which is a very good thing. I mean, these are issues that matter, and there are concerns that people should examine as they look at federated identity. But I think the important thing to think about is that when you go and you're logging in throughout the internet, you're going to be relaying some amount of information about yourself. You can do it sometimes in a pseudonymous way. But you're out there in the world. You're interacting with other sites, other businesses, and they have a legitimate right to want to know something about you to make their services better or fulfill their own requirements. So I think we need to make sure that we're held to standards, that we do what users think we should be doing as far as their privacy goes. And the alternatives of the current system are generally a lot worse.
So on balance, you think that whereas the concerns are real, we probably come out ahead.
Yeah.
And more secure?
I think the security of the system today is actually pretty abysmal. You could argue, some people think that the privacy features are better, but I think when you dig into the details, there's not a whole lot of savings there.
Fair enough. Now, if you actually dive deep on all the different technical concerns that people raised, which we'll do some in a minute, and there's a lot of them, I thought there was a sort of a subtext, which was, we don't trust you. Mm-hmm. And in general, people don't trust people who are identity providers. And let's be honest, people seem to generally not trust Google and Facebook. Mm-hmm. So, how can we address that?
Well, we're big companies. We're in the business of having a lot of information. So skepticism, I think, is warranted. But again, the question is, you have to trust somebody. As you go out and you do business out on the internet or out in the world, you have to relay certain parts of your identity and yourself in certain circumstances. So you're going to have to trust people with some public-facing pieces of information. The question is, how much control do you have? How much visibility do you have in what's going on? And I think we work hard to try to be very clear and transparent with our privacy policy about exactly what we're doing with your information. And at the end of the day, we're really trying to build great user experiences, not just on Google products, but really to make the internet more and more useful to people. Google's business improves as people use the internet more. So that's one of the goals of our team, is really to try to make it easier to go out and do what you want to do on the internet.
I think, one good way to improve trust is just to improve competition, have more of an open ecosystem. And I note that as of yesterday, WordPress is an identity provider. So I think that's nothing but good, have more people in it. So look, we could spend the rest of our time here talking about what we think you ought to care about. But I noticed that on the Google moderator for this thing, a bunch of pretty decent questions popped up. So rather than do that, why don't we talk about the things that you actually have said you're interested in?
Okay.
So the first one was, if it's important that users, this is Bryant in Seattle. And by the way, hey Bryant, good to meet you. I noticed you put a lot of questions on our moderator here. If it's important that users be able to choose their identity provider, why is it that large service providers like Google don't accept federated login? Why can't I log into Google with OpenID connections from my own domain? So Adam, you want to take that?
Yep. So it's actually, Google does do federated identity today. All of our Google Apps customers have the ability to configure via SAML their own identity provider. So typically that's some sort of Active Directory kind of endpoint that will do the authentication for the users, and Google becomes a relying party to that. So we do support federated identity in some cases. Why don't we allow federated identity to any random identity provider? Well, just as I said, you have to trust somebody. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to trust everybody. And there are repercussions with allowing anybody to get into Google's infrastructure and log into an account. So we see a tremendous amount of attempts to abuse Google infrastructure. So, the basic example would be if we allowed anybody to use whatever identity provider they wanted, and that identity provider was not very secure and was easily hacked, and people could compromise those Google accounts by logging in via that identity provider, then a whole bunch of Google resources become available. We're not the gatekeeper for those Google resources once we trust an identity provider, a random identity provider.
In fact, the original idea back in the original OpenID proposal was that everybody should have be able to nominate their own identity provider, and I just have never been convinced that's going to fly. My feeling is we're probably going to be living in a world of whitelisted identity providers one way or another. Where the notion of us maybe relying on Facebook doesn't seem insane to me at all. Yeah. The notion of us relying on whatever identity provider they point to in the world, that one gives me some heartburn.
Yeah. Those accounts would have to be severely restricted in terms of what they could do.
Right. Okay, should an identity provider be able to give relying parties not just access to information, but policy on retention and controls? Why can't I give access to my email address for a month? So that idea doesn't sound insane to me, but as far as I know, we don't do that.
So we actually, our terms of service for Google Plus actually allow when you disconnect from an identity from a relying party, the terms of service for Google Plus, the Google Plus developers' terms of service mandate that the identity provider actually delete all the data, except for a very small portion of kind of core profile information. Having having a lot of information come from the identity provider is one thing, but when you're actually using an identity provider, you're still creating an account on that relying party, and just because you stop using that identity provider doesn't mean that account goes away. So the relying party still needs a few core pieces of information like email address to be able to service you if you want to stop using that identity provider but not stop using that relying party.
Right. Yeah, having said that, in the basic low-level, bottom-level OAuth 2 protocols, there unfortunately is not timed retention. When you give somebody somebody's email address, you just give it to them, and I suspect in most cases they would retain it forever. So that's actually not something that I've seen come up in the standards groups and so on, but it doesn't sound like a crazy idea to me, so maybe we should be thinking about it.
Yep. Okay, next one. Can I bribe you to give Persona a spin, Tim?
Well, okay, just on the subject of bribing me, go for it. I'm down with that. But on Persona, so I actually have been looking at Persona and started diving into it deeply actually last night. And so far, I gotta say, Persona looks about okay to me. I haven't so far run across anything about it that's irritating. A couple of low-level API characteristic glitches, but so after I've gone and done that, you don't even have to bribe me for this. I will write about it at length.
Yeah, I think Persona is an interesting project. Definitely wish them well. I think the browser ID stuff is pretty interesting. That has some really nice privacy features. The Persona service itself, I think probably the coolest part about that is just the privacy policy that goes that's attached to it. They have a nice story there.
Yep.
So speaking of which, Tim, there was one question on YouTube. First of all, I think HR and legal immediately contacted me and say, no, you cannot accept bribes, and it's in violation of Google's terms of service of you as a current employee. But the follow-on, we got a question from Kick You in the Throat over on YouTube, and he says, I'm not wearing a foil hat. I'm just concerned about the policy. So what we want to do is kind of address some of those people who aren't possibly wearing the foil hats, but are concerned about the current direction.
Right, and the comedy turn was irresistible. How many times do you get a chance to wear a tinfoil hat? And I probably got in aggregate between Google Plus and my blog comments and Twitter, 200 or 300 feedbacks of one flavor or another on a thing I wrote, of which there were a few that were pretty well, ooh, evil corporations. But I thought actually the vast majority of them were pretty sensible, and that's why we're doing this, and that's why we're doing an ongoing series on my blog and so on. So pardon the tinfoil hat theater. I wasn't actually talking about you.
Yeah, no, I thought the series that Tim opened up on his blog was really eye-opening. I mean, we do this every day for a living, and so we can get sometimes a little bit in the bubble, and opening up this dialogue has been really great for us to really understand how passionately people feel about this. And we're going to work to try to be more transparent about it and see what we can do to lessen people's concerns.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is that we know, we have data that shows that when there's a certain number of people, when they show up to a website and it asks them to create an account and a password and sign in, they just hit Command W, make the window go away. I'm not doing that. I've had enough passwords, no more. So there were a few people who wrote back in the dialogue online saying, well, when they see a sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google sign, they hit Command W, make the tab go away. They don't want to deal with that, which kind of puts all the people out there building websites in a tough position. Which of those factions is bigger, and how are they going to survive in a world with both those factions in it?
Yeah, and I think one thing about federated identity, the Facebook Connect technology has been so successful. It's so broadly used throughout the internet, that that's sort of synonymous with federated login. And Facebook Connect, for the most part, does mean a fairly significant exchange of information about the user to the relying party. And it's clear. It's very clear to us that that is distasteful for a lot of people. They don't want to share all their friends, give permissions to be able to write to their stream, all of these sorts of things, which are fairly serious privileges. But federated identity doesn't have to be that broad in scope. Sure. It can be extremely narrow. Persona has taken a very narrow approach with only communicating your email address. So there is a middle ground, and we're also working to support very basic levels of federation where very small amounts of information are transmitted, and have that be a completely seamless experience to the user.
And at the end of the day, let's not diss Facebook too much either, because a lot of people like what they do. In many cases, social login is totally appropriate.
Yeah, for many apps, the apps are not very useful if you don't have their friend list, if you don't have the capacity to write to their stream. I mean, they're just not very good apps without having that basic level of functionality. But it's not for all sites and all users.
Okay, time's moving on. Let's move along here. Okay, should Google and other IDPs make a clear declaration of what they will do with the information that you've signed into an app? Apps must declare which of your information they wish to access. Should the IDP be required to state what they'll do?
So yes, at a basic level, we should do this. We have a privacy policy, and we do explain in our privacy policy generally what we do with your information, and probably the most important feature is we don't share it with others without your permission to do so. All the federation flows actually have in it a consent screen which says we're about to give information about you to somebody else. Are you good with that? So that is a core essential principle of everything that we do. Now, what we do internally, a lot of the questions sort of had concerns about what we do internally with the information that we learn about via federation. And I think this has been a good takeaway for me, that we need to try to be a little bit more transparent with what we're doing. I think the reality is today we're not really actually doing anything with that information. It's sitting in a log file someplace and then gets erased after a certain period of time. But there is a lot of work going within Google to try to understand more about our users. We have a very strong conviction that the more we understand our users, the better we can provide services to them. So things like Google Now are predicated on having a fairly rich understanding of the interests, the activities, what users are up to.
Well, let's just take the focus away from Google for a second. And I think the only sane answer to that question is yes. whenever you provide information to somebody, in this case the information about who you're signing into, it has to be clear what's happening with that. So at the moment we've got the privacy policy, which doesn't say anything specific about this particular class of information. Maybe it should, maybe it's good enough as it sits. We'll have to work our way through that.
Yep. Okay, next one. Shouldn't IDP always allow users to refuse access to requested information? This could lead to a broken experience if the relying party isn't expecting missing information, but after a while, RPs will just learn to deal with that. So I think, to sum this up, I think this is, on that consent screen, is there an ability to say, no, I don't want to share my email address or this piece or that
Actually,
piece of information.
it's all over the map. I mean, if you go and look at the different consent screens from different parties for different classes of access, some of them, in particular Google Plus is a good advantage example, gives you very fine-grained control. Yeah, they can see these people but not those people, or they can't see any people and they can do this but not that. And yeah, as the questioner says, the RP has to be prepared to deal with that. Others, it's basically just, including some of ours to be honest, it's just a yes or no. Yeah, they want your email and your basic profile. Is that okay? Yes or no? And we don't provide fine-grained control.
So this is actually something that's a hot topic with us these days. I think the questioner makes a good point that the relying party, they ask for a certain body of information, and if they don't get it, that they don't know necessarily what to do with that user. On the other side, some functionality might be predicated on having access to certain information, and so it makes for a lot more complicated an app. What we're thinking about right now is to have more of an incremental way to deal with it. So an app can ask for very little at the very beginning, and then as you march through the app and interact with different pieces of functionality in the app, to ask for those additional privileges just in time. So the context is clear, and the user kind of sees what the quid pro quo is for giving access to that.
But you know, it's horribly complicated. The user experience people give us no end of grief when we want to be pestering users all the time for this permission, that permission. Also, there's the unfortunate fact that if you look at the statistics, there's a substantial proportion of people that just click OK whenever you put something in front of them and don't even think about it. And every time you make the dialogue more complex and subtle, you know, the proportion that just click OK goes up, right? Because they don't want to take time to be reading that. So we want to, you know, not pester people excessively, particularly if that's going to decrease the security. But on the other hand, you would like to offer more fine-grained privilege. No, I don't know what the answer is, but it's something we got to keep working on.
This I always find this the great conundrum of this job is, on that consent page, I'm not sure if it's better for the consent rate to go up or for it to go down.
Okay, so this one's easy, and we're running out of time, so I want to take a couple more here. Is there any way to retroactively revoke just some of the permissions I've given away by federating, like if I log in with Google Plus in an app? Can I keep authenticating and let them see my email, but revoke post to my circles? And the answer is?
Yes.
Good.
For that one in particular, not all constellations of privileges can be individually managed that way, but with respect to Google Plus, circles, and posting, that you can control.
So what can an ordinary web user do to decrease their exposure when their identity provider collaborates with the NSA? What federation technologies could they choose that don't give their identity provider access to web browsing history? So, good news and bad news. First of all, the IDP does not get access to your web browsing history. It may get access to the events when you actually authenticated, but that's a very small subset of your interactions with any site. But it's bad news. I mean, if the NSA really wants to know, they will send a legal document to your ISP. Not your search engine, not your IDP, not your IDP, your ISP, and your ISP will, put a pipe in the side of their router, and the NSA will know every website you visit. And given that this is known to be happening, whether or not they're incrementally tracking where you happen to get authenticated, it just doesn't seem like a big deal to me. Now, there are a variety of techniques you can use to increase your online privacy, but as Ed Snowden said, whereas the encryption flowing across the wire is pretty good, the endpoint encryption is generally terrible and weak, and if you really want to be secure, you have to look at technologies like Tor and so on, which are kind of inconvenient and icky to use, and it's tough. I mean, it is really, really tough, and I don't think this has anything to do with technology. I think this is a policy and legal problem.
Agreed. And we'll see where that one works. How that one works itself out. SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect, Facebook Connect, IndieAuth, Persona. Sometimes it seems like there are as many Federation technologies as identity providers. Is there any indication that one of these is going to win?
That's Bryant again. Hey, Bryant. So I think none of them are going to win in the sense of sweeping all the others away. Inside the big company enterprise, SAML is pretty dominant.
Yeah,
pretty well
yeah.
everybody uses that, but I don't think SAML is going to work worth beans out on the broader internet. It's just not designed for that. So I think OpenID Connect is going to be widely deployed out there because it already is. We're doing it. Microsoft's working on it. Lots of other people are. OAuth in general, on which OIDC is based, is, like for example, the recently announced WordPress IDP is based on OAuth too. Persona's got a chance. We'll see. By the way, I have my own little individual identity test bed with a little site that you can log into, and I've wired it up to 3 or 4 different flavors of protocols, and I'm going to wire it up to Persona in the next few days. And I think living in a multi-identity protocol future is actually not so terrible. I think that if we end up stuck with a few, that's okay. Nothing terribly wrong with that.
It does add a lot of complexity for developers, but hopefully there will be tools that'll make that easier for developers to manage. Does the requirement to pre-register my app's URL with an OAuth IDP mean that I have to let that IDP know about secret pre-launch or internal apps?
Well, yeah, but all you really have to do is register the URL and name and optionally a graphic. And I don't think we're actually looking at those, to tell you the truth.
No, we're not really looking at those, and it doesn't give anybody any ability to go beyond the front door of what that login page is. So,
your IDP
so if you're in stealth mode, just have a stealthy front page, and that should do it.
So I think we're pretty well out of time. Thank you. That was useful. We're going to keep on working through this on our blog, and we'll probably do another one of these ones on it because the questions keep flowing in.
And please dial into Tim's blog to continue the conversation.
Okay. Thank you for dropping by.